Good afternoon to you all. How does this day find you? I thank you for meeting with me today. I am Elizabeth Johnston, and I am indeed a Loyalist. And I would presume you to be patriots. If you would call yourself an American patriot, do let me know. I must say, during the American War for Independence, I would never have dreamed of having so many patriots in my home. But thankfully, those times are in the past now. I hope that during our meeting we can commit to being civil with one another. Do you agree? Very good. I wonder, are there any of you who would not call yourselves an American patriot? Or are there those of you who would rather not take a side? As the majority of you feel rather strongly about being an American patriot, or as they would have been called, as they have been called as well, rebels, revolutionaries, continentals, or Whigs, let us first make sure that we understand what that means. I understand the term as people who are subjects of King George III in the American colonies who indeed rejected the rule of the British Crown and declared themselves the United States of America, an independent nation. Now let us define the term Loyalist. We have also been called Royalists, Tories, or even the King's Men, but they all mean the same thing, and that is someone who is loyal to the British Crown, who believed that the true leader of this land was King George III. It is true that I am indeed loyal to the British Empire and its liberal constitution. I am loyal to my country of birth, which was British. I am loyal to the government under which my father and my husband served. I am loyal to the ideals of the British Constitution, which recognize the rights that your American Constitution would recognize after the war. But my being a loyalist does not tell you who I am. It only tells you a part of my story. So let us begin at the beginning. I am an only child. I was born on a small farm beside the little Ogochee River on the 28th of May, 1764, to parents who reflected the very diverse roots of Georgia's earliest immigrants. My father, John Lichtenstein, had emigrated from St. Petersburg, Russia, and was employed as a scout boat pilot by the Royal Colonial Government. My mother, Catherine de Gaulle, was of French heritage, and sadly died from illness when I was only 10 years old. Before that tragedy, my childhood was spent on my father's plantation in Skidaway Island, where I would enjoy figs, peaches, pomegranates, and plums, fine fish, oysters, crabs, and shrimp on this island home. And when my mother died in 1774, I felt her loss keenly. I was sent to live with my great-aunt who schooled me in needlework, and especially embroidery. 1774 was a year of great change in my personal life, but also a time of great change in the colonies. The Revolutionary War had commenced in Boston and began to spread to the south, reaching even Savannah, where I was. It was such a time when men's passions and prejudices were so much inflamed that you would not dare declare your sentiments, even in the most modest of terms, without giving offense to one side or the other. I myself, like many Loyalists, had hoped for a peaceful reconciliation between the colonies and the Crown, but that was not to be. Everywhere the scum rose to the top. By 1776, the people in Georgia were quite inflamed against the government of Great Britain and were raising a rugged crops of all sorts. In time, all were forced to, declare if they were on the side of the king or on the side of the rebels. Those refusing to join the rebels were imprisoned, tarred and feathered, or worse. Loyalists also had their land confiscated, livelihoods ruined. I recall a horrible incident with a man named Thomas Brown. Mr. Brown, like many who had immigrated to the colony, sought a better life for himself in the back country of Georgia as a planter. He had no strong feelings to take the side of the Patriots or the Loyalists. He simply wanted to live his life as a planter undisturbed. but a gang of rebel patriots came to his home and asked to whom Mr. Brown was loyal. When he would not give his allegiance to their cause, they then demanded his loyalty. Demanded it! These patriots who claimed to fight for liberties and independence, free speech being one of these ideals, they demanded loyalty to their ideals. Well, when Mr. Brown refused, they beat him, cracking his skull, tied him to a tree, and lit his feet aflame. Were these men patriots, as you define it? Was this a right thing to do? Why would men feel so justified in making someone else suffer for their beliefs? My family personally experienced violence and hatred as well. My husband, Captain William Johnston, had 2 brothers who were killed by patriots. Andrew was killed while successfully leading a company who were taking provisions or supplies to Augusta, which was then taken over by rebels. His other brother, John, or Jack as he was nicknamed, was taken prisoner by the rebels and put to death in cold blood, rather than giving him any sort of fair justice. Fairness was not to be found in the hearts of these rebels, these patriots. My husband was devastated by Jack's death, and one afternoon he said to me, "I expect some friends to be here tonight, and I would like supper for them at 11 o'clock. I expect about 20 men." I had supper provided, and at about 11, the company rode up to the house. Some of them were gentlemen I knew, friends of my husband's, but others were bad-looking men, not gentlemen at all. After the supper, they remounted their horses, and William stopped a moment to put on his sword and make ready his pistols, and then bid me goodbye. I asked him when he would be back. He answers, "Bet," that's what he called me, "if I return at all, I will be back in 24 hours. Oh, I slept very little that night and spent the next day in anxious prayer for his safe return. At 12 o'clock, well, it arrived, but no tidings of him. At last, about 2 o'clock, I heard the sounds of horses riding past the house and saw him dismount, and then he came in. He embraced me and he threw his sword and pistol on the table, both of which I could see had been used. I said to him, 'William, where have you been?' He replied to Bet, 'Never ask me where I have been or what I have done, but now we don't owe the rebels anything for Jack.' My father narrowly escaped a mob of patriots. He was shaving and preparing to dress so that he may escape by boat, for he knew that danger was coming. He just did not know how close it had become. It was by the bark of a dog that he was alerted to an armed party approaching the house. He had just enough time to go through the door that opened to the garden, leap the fence, and lay himself low at a little distance in some tall grass that concealed him. He could hear the men talking loudly to his servants and saying that he could not be far off, for his clothes and his watch were still in his room. They said that if he was above ground, they would catch him, but they did not. With the help of one of his slaves, my father was able to make it to the British warship, the HMS Scarborough. My father and I were separated for a time after this, which was quite distressing. Violence just begets violence, and during the siege of Savannah in 1779, I experienced the war for myself. Nearly 10,000 men, French and American, had surrounded Savannah and greatly outnumbered the British forces of only 1,800 men. My family, or those who were not fighting, that is, needed to seek refuge from the cannon and rifle fire. One morning we set out to the wharf so that we could take a boat to a nearby island. Oh, I will never forget the sound of the battery, the balls of the guns whizzing past our ears at an awful rate. But with God's guidance, we made it to the island safely. By July of 1782, Savannah was evacuated, and my husband and I went to Charleston, then to East Florida, then to Scotland, where my husband would continue with his medical studies that he had started before the war, and then to Jamaica, and then finally to Nova Scotia. All due to our being unwelcome and feeling unsafe in America. As I recollect these memories, I must admit, that I have tried to put most of them behind me, for they were very difficult and troubling times for me and my family. But I understand the importance of sharing those experiences so that, well, you don't just get a one-sided side of the story. So, I ask you, how do you understand this war? How do you understand how neighbors and fellow countrymen could turn against one another? Or perhaps you have your own questions for me.
All right. Hello, hello. This is Liva from behind the scenes, and I am happy to assist in asking your questions for Mrs. Johnston. Thank you so much, Mrs. Johnston, for taking the time to share your perspective today.
Absolutely.
Now, while folks are thinking of those questions to ask you, I wonder, could you describe what you experienced, the most terrifying moment of your experience? I do understand that you were but a teenager in Savannah, and can you describe what you actually saw and heard during the scarier moments?
Yes, so of course I was always scared for my family who were fighting. The anxiousness does never it never goes away when you have a loved one out in harm's way, but I myself did not feel very much in danger until the war came, well, closer to home. That is danger from the armies, that is. I feel as a woman who was in the South for the time of the Revolution, it is a much different experience than those who were in the North. In the North, there was more patriot favor. There was not as many strong loyalists. And in Georgia, well, we're named Georgia after King George. It was very much a place where loyalists had been. We were very loyal to the king. And well, there were also lots of patriots, but it was more not just of a revolution in the South, but more of a what you would call civil war. And friends would turn on friends and neighbors turn on neighbors. It was very concerning and difficult to figure out who you could trust, of who you could share, well, anything with, especially political affiliations. Well, of course, when the armies came, that was incredibly terrifying. And my family and I, of course, we tried to escape from the town of Savannah that was being battered, and just the sounds of the gunfire and the cannons, the roar and the shakes of the grounds, that was something I would never forget, but would quite like much to. Of course, we made it to an island that was a little farther from Savannah to take refuge, and I thank God that we were able to make it there safely. I don't want to imagine what might have become of us if we had not been able to make it. I feel like we very well could have witnessed many more horrors.
All right, and let me check to see if we have any questions yet. Do feel free to chat your questions, folks. I'm just going to check right here. And Miss Johnston, can you tell us about where you had to flee? I understand that because when you left Savannah, you did not really have your home anymore. So when you and your family fled, where did you go? And tell us about that experience of trying to find some kind of home outside of what was your home, Savannah.
Yes, so many loyalists decided to leave. They felt no longer welcome, or their properties had been confiscated, their livelihoods ruined. Well, where else are you to go, especially when, well, I would call it, the scum rose to the top, and now you have these people who think that, well, you are less than them, and they are in charge. So it's not like you can just really start up again. You need to go somewhere else, and many of us felt that way. A lot of loyalists who were in the South, especially in Georgia, decided to flee to Florida, which had still, it was not a part of the colonies that had rebelled, and therefore it was a safer place. A lot of loyalists in the North decided to go to Nova Scotia, which we eventually ended up in after going about the British Empire for a little bit. And in Nova Scotia, there it was still again, a place that was not the American colonies. It was still loyal to the British Crown in that province of Canada. And there I was able to meet a lot of, well, fellow American loyalists who had many of the same sentiments and some of the same experiences as I. And we were able to start a life there with, of course, my husband and my children.
Now, see, we do have a question about your marriage. Now, you were married at a fairly young age,
Yes.
15 years old. Can you talk to us about, surely at the age of 15, you did not expect to be confronted with the terrors of war. When you married your husband, and if you could tell us a little bit about your husband, tell us about what you thought life was going to be like. What would life had been like for a newly wed bride in your time?
Yes. So I was married at a rather young age, that you might, or at least you might think so today. And as I was saying when I was talking about my childhood, I grew up on the plantation of my father, who was, well, indeed, quite wealthy. So I was always a child of privilege. I never had to want for much. And of course, a lady of my social standing is expected to marry well, and I do believe I did. Of course, my time for courting came about almost at the time of the war. So I began to be courted, of course, by officers in the British Army, as that is what my family was. We were loyal to the crown and loyal to the king, and of course, a lot of fine young gentlemen ended up being officers in the army and putting their other careers on hold. My husband had been going to university to study to be a doctor, and he was then, of course, in the army as an officer, as were two of his brothers. And after the war, he then went to Scotland to continue his medical training, and I went with him. But that is not how I would have envisioned my life before, well, the revolution began. Of course, I was be expected to be a wife and a mother to, especially someone of my social standing, would be expected of me to be a hostess in my husband's home, to throw parties and have people in for dinner and conversation, and of course to oversee my children's studies as they grew up, and to concern myself with things that were perhaps of a what you would consider a more womanly nature than war. But that life had other plans.
Now, you're clearly very well spoken, and I wonder if you could tell us about what kind of education that you did receive, or perhaps women of your social class typically receive.
Yes, so for myself, my schooling was done at home. Mostly ladies like myself might have a governess or a tutor that would come into the home and teach them how to read and write. Usually we were schooled in conversational French, which of course was helpful when we went up to Canada. But for myself, I had my aunt, my elderly aunt, who I went to go live with after my mother's death, as my mother would have been and had, up until the time of her illness, been educating me. My aunt was very much a skilled woman in needlework, and she very much wanted to instill in me the skills of embroidery. So that was part of my education from her. And of course, we would then learn about what would be considered proper education for a young lady, which would include how to serve as a hostess and the social arts of conversation. And also, we were not skilled in what you might call practical sewing. I would not necessarily make my own clothes. That's not the type of needlework I am talking about. I would have another person do that for me. But for a lady of myself, it would be considered a proper pastime to do decorative needlework. Needlework that was not necessarily useful, but beautiful, and it would then be displayed in my home.
All right, our next question is going to come from Gwen. Gwen is wondering, what did you and your family have to leave behind once you fled? So we know that you had to leave your home, but what were you able to take with you, if anything, and what did you have to leave behind?
Yes, so my father had to flee for a time. And with that, he didn't have anything. He barely had clothes on when he made his escape to the British warship. Myself, it was after the war. We did not have to flee in the middle of the night. It was, well, the Patriots have won. We don't feel welcome here anymore. Where do we go now? And we were then able to pack our things. Of course, travel is difficult, and you can only pack so much in a trunk or a couple of trunks. But I would have taken my clothes, my special possessions. We would still have to leave behind the house a good amount of furniture. But I could take what I needed with me. We went to Charleston. That's a very large port city right up the river and from the Savannah. And then we would go to Edinburgh for my husband to continue his medical studies. So that's quite the trip across the Atlantic Ocean. Therefore, we aren't going to be taking all that much with us. But we were able to leave with what we wanted to and what we felt we could carry. We did not have to flee in the middle of the night at that time.
Let's see, we have a question wondering, did you ever play a musical instrument, or would women of your social class and time have been expected to learn certain musical instruments or perhaps even sing?
Yes, so we would, that would be part of our education, would be to learn how to play certain musical instruments so that we could entertain at parties or social gatherings, usually smaller social gatherings. We would not be playing or singing for any great large ball, but after a dinner party, it does make for some good fun to have a little bit of a talent show, if you will, where we can show off our skills and entertain one another. So ladies were encouraged to play certain instruments and were discouraged to play others. A lady of my time would be encouraged to play the harpsichord, or very similar to the piano today. Also, the harp would be an instrument of choice. Some ladies thought it's a little too scandalous to play the harp. It exposes the arms, and one must straddle it like a horse, like a gentleman rides a horse. And so some ladies thought it was fine to play the harp. Others looked down upon it. Singing, of course, would be a skill which ladies would be expected. Ladies were discouraged from playing wind instruments, so instruments that you have to blow through, especially brass ones. The flute was one that could be an exception could be made for, and that was one of the more accessible instruments for a lady. But those would be, I would say, some of the main ones that you would play. You also might have what you would call a zither. It's very much a small form of a harp. One does not have to straddle it, and it's much smaller. It's only about yay big, and therefore one can just strum it easily. It's almost like a lute, and that would be an acceptable instrument as well. Of course, one was never to play publicly for money or on a stage. That was rather discouraged and frowned upon as well for a lady of my social standing.
Let's see. David would like to know, why would a daughter of a Russian immigrant feel loyalty to the crown?
Well, my father did serve under the crown when he became an immigrant here, and it is the country of my birth. I do view myself as a British subject, as a British citizen. He came to America for a better life and believed that the British crown could provide that for him, which he did believe it did. And for a time, we were very, very happy together as a family in the colonies as they were ruled by Great Britain. And it was not until the Patriots started their upheaval that, well, we began to feel the afflictions of sorrow. So it was his country of choice, truly. He could have, I guess, either stayed in Russia or gone anywhere else, but since it was his country of choice, he felt great loyalty to it and believed in the cause of the king and wanted to remain loyal to that, and therefore our family were loyalist. I feel very strongly about and still support my views as being a loyalist during the side of the American Revolution.
And can you describe, were political conversations something that women would participate in? You being married to a military officer, would you also contribute to conversations about the war, or would you listen? What was your experience like in that situation?
Yes, so as I've been saying, most of my stories are of my husband, my brother-in-laws, and my father. As a lady of my time and social standing is expected to support the political views of her father or her husband, and the husband's or father's political views are then that of the entire families. Independent political views are not necessarily encouraged, yet they do happen, of course. We know that not all wives and mothers agree with their families, but one does not necessarily voice those publicly. My husband and I, of course, have engaged in conversation about these topics, but in public, at dinner parties and such, it is not generally considered polite. It's not part of the arts of conversation to hold political discussions for, well, ladies and gentlemen. It is something that usually the gentlemen will retire to their own parlor and the ladies will retire to their own parlor, and then the gentlemen will discuss crops and politics, which they would consider boring to the ladies. But of course, ladies do, as myself, find these incredibly important topics for ourselves as they affect us as well. But they're not something that we're necessarily encouraged to talk about our feelings on, and would do so with great caution. I, of course, myself, being a loyalist in Georgia at the time, would express myself with great caution. It was only until later that I would record and very publicly voice my opinions about what I had experienced, as I did not want, well, the victors to have all the spoils. I thought it would be a great disservice to history if I did not speak my side.
And our next question comes from Gwen as well. Gwen's wondering, did your family own slaves? If so, what happened to them when you left?
Yes, so my father ran a plantation on Skidaway Island in which people were enslaved. I am not completely sure what happened to those enslaved people upon his leaving or his deciding upon what to happen. That was not my business. I was in Nova Scotia with my husband.
And do you feel like your family has finally settled at this point in your life, settled down in a new community, or do you feel like you're still trying to find a home? When did you settle down?
Well, we moved a lot of places after the revolution, and of course when I'm with my family I feel home, but I do consider the country of my birth, the British colonies, to be my home. But I do feel that Nova Scotia has become my new home. That is where we have stayed the longest, and I hope I see a future for us here where we can stay longer and raise our family, and my husband can continue with his medical practice. And I think here we have found ourselves a new home.
And Nadine would like to know, who was included in your traveling party to Scotland, and did you ever return to Georgia?
Yes. So it was my husband and I, and of course any children that we had or were in the process of having. Well, we were there is who we went to Scotland with, and I never truly returned to Georgia. No, I felt unsafe and unwelcome, and it was a place of past memories, both pleasant but a lot hurtful and terrifying, and not a place that I would want to revisit, nor do I have any family relations there. So, no, I never went back to Georgia.
Ms. Johnston, we have appreciated your time here today. Perhaps you could leave us with your thoughts on what are your hopes for your family, and perhaps if you are willing to think about the new United States, what are your thoughts on its future? What do you hope for between these loyalists and patriots, people who have disagreed quite a bit and even shown violence toward each other? What are your hopes for the future?
Well, of course, as I have said, I have always hoped for a peaceful reconciliation between the colonies and the government of Great Britain. Do I see that happening in the time that I am in right now? Perhaps not. But I do think that that would be the best outcome for both. For my family, I would hope that we are able to grow up safely and securely where they do not have to fear the horrors of war, and that they can grow up to be good citizens and indeed, hopefully, loyal ones.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Johnston, and thank you so much to all of our visitors today. We appreciate you coming to this program today and learning a bit about the Loyalist perspective. If you've enjoyed this, please consider becoming a digital member of the Northeast Georgia History Center. Information will be in the chat soon. And again, thank you so much for joining us today. We hope to see you again soon.
Good day to you.